Hi guys, in this video we're going to cover CSS, specifically specificity, selectors, and how to troubleshoot style conflicts. I've seen quite a few posts on the Ignition forums about people saying their themes or their styles aren't behaving how they expect. So I think this might be a useful video. Hopefully this doesn't make it more confusing, but is clarifying. Hopefully you get something useful out of this video. I even created a PowerPoint this time, so let's see how this goes. CSS selectors is a big thing we're going to cover. We're going to run through a few slides about selectors, and then I'll open the designer and show you how to use those selectors, which ones are available to you in the designer, and which ones aren't, which ones you can use using custom CSS, all of them, because it's just regular CSS under the hood. And then we'll look at specificity. Okay, so second slide. We have a few basic types of selectors. The first type I want to cover is the element selector. This one, as far as I know, is not available inside the designer. So in other words, as far as I know, there's no way to use an element selector. An example of this, just like you see in the slide here, select all buttons and give it a background color of aqua, or any other style. Any other property can be put inside this selector here, and then it'll style it. This is the lowest precedence, or the lowest specificity, as you'll see in the last slides in this slide deck. Hopefully that'll make sense to you when we cover that, but it's not very specific. If you think about it, on a regular web page that you might go to, for example, your favorite web page like Reddit or anything else, if you go to the dev tools, you can find probably hundreds of buttons. So it's not very specific. It doesn't have a specific button in mind. It says style all of these buttons in this way. Let's look at another selector. You will be familiar with this selector if you've used the designer for any period of time. It's the class selector, and when you create style classes inside the designer and use them on your components, you are using the class selector. If you've looked in the CSS files that are generated by the designer, it looks like this, except so it uses the dot notation. We know that this is a class selector because there's a dot here, but the designer or Ignition or the build process, I'm not sure what, will prepend a PSC, so a dot PSC dash, and then your class name here. We'll take a look at that in the designer. That'll make more sense. But this one is familiar to us because it's also more specific. We can set style classes on certain buttons. For example, if we have 100 buttons on our page, or 100 of anything, or any number of anything actually on our page, and we want to set a base style, we can use the element selector. Like we covered in the last slide, you select all HTML elements of a certain type, style them, and then you can use the class selector since it's a little bit more specific because you add the style class to certain components. You can style it with different styles, and since it's more specific, it'll have precedence, and then the CSS algorithm, or the browser, I guess the client, will decide to use the class style. So here we're overriding the same class. If you look here, button background color, the property, we're overriding it with my custom class. So in the end, the background color of the button, if we add this style class to the button, it'll be maroon instead of aqua. Okay, let's cover. So this one is in the designer. It's available to us. The ID selector is the last selector type I want to talk about. This one is also, as far as I'm aware, it's not available in the designer, i.e. you can't add styles and use an ID selector from the designer directly, although you can using custom CSS, which we'll see. We know it's an ID selector by the hash symbol there in the beginning, or an octothorpe, or whatever you want, a pound sign, whatever you want to call it. And in this case, if we add this ID to the same button that had our custom class, my custom class. In the end, even though we have three properties trying to style the same, three selectors trying to style the same property, in the end, since the ID is very specific, each DOM element has a unique ID, or should have a unique ID anyway. It's very specific. It's the most specific selector we've seen. So it'll, in the end, the button, which has an element type of button, as we saw, which has a class, a style class of my custom class, a very descriptive name, and which has the DOM ID of my DOM ID. In the end, it'll have a color of gold. Even if this selector here is the last thing on the page, it'll still be colored gold because it is very specific. This is where specificity comes in. And then with selectors, so last slide before we go into the designer and review some of the slides we just talked about, is you can nest selectors. There's a lot of documentation online that can explain this a lot better than I can, especially in MDN. You can nest selectors. I think they're called combinators. Again, I'm not the authority on this at all. I just know CSS somewhat. So if you say, for example, you want to select all buttons that are direct children of divs, so not you may have a div and then several layers in, other divs, and then you can have a container and then a button inside. That will not be selected. The only buttons that will be selected are the ones that are direct children of divs. If you want to select those, you can do it this way. So I'm just showing you different examples, or you'll see this sort of notation, selecting by attributes. A lot of perspective components, the underlying HTML element is a div. For example, the flex container. And here you can see we're selecting by the HTML attribute data component. And then we're selecting buttons that are children, or descendants of divs that have an attribute of ia.container.flex. So there are many different selector types. So now let's go into the designer, and we're going to add some styles in the designer and also write some custom CSS code. If you've never seen CSS like this, don't panic. It's pretty easy to pick up. And we're pretty much adding these properties inside the designer anyway. It may have a different syntax. For example, background color in the designer, if you use the little booklet, will be background and then capital C color with no dash, but it's the same properties. Enough mumbo jumbo, let's jump into the designer. Okay, here's my designer, and I have a few scenarios. This video was originally going to be setting up 3 scenarios and then troubleshooting why the styles behaved the way they did. But I think we can just take a generic look at styles, and it also will be helpful, hopefully. So I have 3 views, scenario 1, scenario 2, and scenario 3. They have 3 groups of buttons, and I thought it would be useful to show you how styles are applied, and then we can, at the very end, talk about specificity and why certain styles are preferred over others. So let's go to scenario 1. You don't really need to recreate this as long as you pay attention. It's also pretty simple. It's not all that complicated what I'm talking about. So first of all, let's just save this and let's go to the client, which is the browser. I'm going to open scenario 1. Let's see where this blue color on the button is coming from. As you can see, there's no background color property here, and there's also no style class, but it's getting its color here from somewhere. So let's open the client or the browser, and then let's open DevTools. It's the F12 key, if you don't know, and then let's hit this little button here, and then select the button. And then, as I was saying, a lot of components are actually divs. So even though there is a button component, there's also a div inside. I guess I selected the button. Okay. So if we select this button here, we can see that there is, if we look in the styles here, we can see that there is a class called IA_button dash primary that's coming from light CSS, which we'll see here shortly. And there is a background color of a variable, but that variable is actually just the primary color. So if we toggle this, it should go to the browser default, I believe. There we go. So we can toggle these properties here. This is where if you just drag on a button inside the designer into your view, this is where it'll get its color if it's a primary button. So of course, let's go back into the designer. Let's add our own style class. And I actually already have one, a style class called Scenario 1. And inside this style class, I have a background color of red. So if you don't know how to use a style class, the base style here, and let me go to background and then just type in a color, red, hit OK, and then go back to my button and add the style class here. There we go. Scenario 1 is added. So now we are using a class selector. So let's save this. It's a class selector just like this one here was. Let's see, just like it was previously. But now we have another class selector that has, since it's defined after, so hopefully this does not get confusing. If there are two class selectors and both of them have one single class, the one that's defined later in the cascade or in the file, so you have a CSS file. If you imagine a very long CSS file, it's not usually like that. You usually have imports. But if all the CSS for the project was in one file, whatever class is defined later in the file, closer to the bottom, that's the styling that will be applied. That's why, even though, let me undo this change. So just to make this super clear, even though this is also a class selector here, if you look, button has a class selector IA. Here's the dot notation, so we know it's a class. And actually, if we open here, I opened it to the location, and if we go to light, this directory here, I believe it's common. And then if we go to button.css, here we go, there's a class here. The dot notation, button primary, and then there, somewhere in this file, you'll see that there's a background color applied here, IA button primary, but our custom class, our custom style class, our custom CSS is added after this. So the cascading, the C in CSS really comes into play here. And that is why when we add a style class here, hopefully this does not confuse anyone. When we add our own, even though they're both style classes, our style class will win and be applied to the button in the end. So let me select this and go here, and you'll even see a helpful button. You'll see my class here. This is the PSC I was talking about. So this gets prepended automatically, PSC dash my style class here, and then you can see that it's applying a background color. If I turn this off, it goes back to the default background color. You can see here where it's crossed out. This one is losing. This style, even though it's a class selector, is losing to this class selector just because this one comes after this class where it's defined in the actual CSS. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful. Let's take a look at a different scenario. So this first button will have a style class of scenario 1. Let's style this second button differently. So if you've used the designer, this is perfectly obvious to you. You can add a background property here. There's even this helpful menu that opens up, background color. Here's what I was talking about. So this is more like JSX, like React style camel case instead of using the dash. So it even added a color for me. That's kind of weird. I don't know why it happened. But you see that when I added When I added this background color, even though I have a scenario 1, this scenario 1, lest you forgot, has a background color. And on the button, there's a default background color, but in the end, the one that's applied, as we can see visually in the designer, is this color that we specify here. So let's look back in the browser and see where our style comes into play. So let me click on the actual button element. So when we were talking about elements and button was one of the element types, here's what I'm talking about. You can see that there's an actual element, HTML element, in the markup called a button. So let me click on that, and then let's look inside our styles. This will be more interesting than the first scenario we had. So we can find two times that our background color will be superseded or won out by a different property. So let's look at this class here, IA underscore button dash primary. There's a background color that is set by default. This is the primary color. If we look a little bit higher, there's our style class. It's called PSC-scenario1, where we also try to set a background color. But in the very end, the color that wins out, the color that actually applies to the element is this element.style. What does this mean? Is this a class called .style? Well, no, this refers to the inline style. So we can even look here on the button that there is a style background color. Okay, and here's where specificity comes into play. We've kind of teased this for a while. Inline styles will always have precedence, even over ID selectors. So in a second here, we'll add an ID selector and try to see which one will win out in the end. So we'll have 4 competing selectors, and then in the end, the inline style will still win. This is actually bad practice. If you're writing HTML code in a traditional environment, you don't want to have inline styles because it's very difficult to manage, as you can imagine. So whenever you style anything here on the component itself, it becomes an inline style in the markup. As you can see here, here's our color, and it's applying. So let's go back to our slides. I actually have a few slides on this. Here's nesting selectors. Let me present. Okay, here we're going to talk about specificity finally. Like I said, we already covered this. An ID selector is always more specific than any number of class selectors. So what I didn't show you is that you can have many class selectors. You can have multiple class selectors, either nested using the greater than symbol or just by spaces, either direct descendants or descendants or just children. You can have many of them. So in our example here, we had 2 element selectors. So these are 2 element selectors. Here's an attribute, here's an element, and then here's an attribute selector and an element. So you can add any number of these. One ID selector is always more specific than any number of class selectors. One class selector is more specific than any number of element selectors. So even though we have 2 element selectors here, if we had a different style even above this style in the CSS that used one class selector, it is more specific, and that class will be applied in the end. To make things a little bit more complicated, but not really, something we just spoke on, inline styles are always more specific than any ID selectors. Even if you have multiple ID selectors, an inline style, so which is the style you see in the browser or in the designer, will always be more specific than any of these selectors. So in the end, when you're troubleshooting your CSS and you apply a certain style, for example, a background color, since that's what we're dealing with in this video, you apply a background color to a component and it doesn't style it visually. The only other problem, or the only thing that it can be, as far as I'm aware, is this pesky rule called important, or exclamation mark important. Whenever you use exclamation mark important, all of these styles here get thrown out the window. Inline styles, doesn't matter how many ID selectors, class selectors, element selectors, or whether you're using inline styles, all of that gets thrown out the window, and the style that will win out in the end, or is the most specific, is this rule here called the important rule. You can see why this is a bad idea, by the way. If you use multiple important rules on an element or a class anywhere in your project, if you use them multiple times in different CSS files, it becomes a nightmare to track down. So if you have multiple important rules trying to style the same component, for example, or element, then the one that's defined last. So if you have a long file, again, the one that's defined closest to the bottom of the CSS file will be the one that eventually applies to the component. That's the one you will visually see. So just to recap, if you're applying styles and if you're trying to troubleshoot why a certain component isn't styled how you would expect it to be, and you didn't add any custom CSS, as we will see here in a second, if you apply inline styles and it doesn't affect your component, then you have a problem. This scenario should never occur. Inline styles are always the most specific selector. I don't know if that's the right term. It's more specific than any number of ID, class, and element selectors, including pseudo class and pseudo element, which we didn't cover. Okay, let's go back into the designer. So we have an inline style here. So just so you remember, let's add another button actually. That way we have 4 different types of, or 4 different ways of styling. So let me add this button and add margin bottom just to space it out evenly. Even though I know I shouldn't, I usually find myself writing inline styles just because writing, creating style classes becomes cumbersome because you open up 2 different workspaces, and I'm just lazy, even though that's bad practice. I do find myself just writing inline styles. That's not something to be boastful of. Anyway, I added this button here to the top. This top button, all we have is the primary styles that are applied by the default styles that are applied by inductive automation or by ignition, by the design, by the gateway. I never know what to call that entity. I don't fully understand it, but it's applied by the gateway when we don't style a button. When we just drag on a button and save it and use it in our project, it'll use the primary style as we saw in the dev tools. The second button, it's obviously using the same primary style. That one doesn't go away, but since we added our own custom class, it's more towards the bottom of the file. Hopefully that makes sense. And then, so our scenario 1 style class ends up being applied, which is this background red color here. So in the end, this button ends up being red, even if we save this and view it in our session. This button is obviously still red, and we covered why that was. Here we have an example of an inline style. So inline style, this is the most specific. As I said earlier, if you style something with an inline style and it doesn't take effect, that should never happen, by the way, especially if you haven't touched any custom CSS, as we will do here in a second before we finish up. That shouldn't happen, but if it does happen, we will take a look at what you can do to find out what's going wrong and why it's happening. So this last style here, I want to show you an example of an ID selector. Again, like I said towards the beginning of this video, I don't know of any way how to use an ID selector without writing custom CSS code, but I'll show you how you can do it modifying the actual CSS, the underlying files. So let me show you here an example really quickly. Let me show you the session properties here. I'm using the light theme. This is important. So you need to be using this theme here, needs to match where you are in this directory. So go to follow along if you want to, go to your inductive automation ignition installation location. So here's the root directory. I have data here, go to data, and then go to modules, the perspective module, themes, and then you have all of your CSS files here. They're just plain old CSS files, just like you would use in a traditional web development environment. I created this folder called custom, and inside this custom folder is where we'll add our own CSS files, including our ID selector. But since we're using the light CSS theme here, as you can see, the entry point for that theme is this file here. And if you take a look at this file, it has one line. It's an import statement. It imports light directory index.css, which is light. This file it imports, which then in turn imports different files, including from these directories. So it cascades, but in the end, it's all one long file. You can think of it in that way. Okay, so I added this custom /style.css file here, and I want to make it so that the light theme will be aware of my files. So one way to do it would be to just add an import statement to your light file, to your light theme. If you don't want to change themes, just use the light theme and you have just a few things you want to change. What I find myself doing, I'm not sure if this is best practice. This is obviously up to you. I just edit this light.css file and add my own import. So there's a particular way you have to add imports. You can read about it in the README. So I'm going to add my custom style.css file here. And then let me save. It'll ask me to open in administrator mode. So screen probably blanked. And it lets me save here now that it's open in administrator mode. Okay, so inside my style.css file, since now our project will be able to see this file, it'll be imported. Let's open it and let's add an ID selector. So open, edit with Notepad++, style.css, here it is. So as you saw from the slides, to use an ID selector, we would use the octothorpe, the hash, the # notation. But first, what I forgot to do was give my button a DOM ID. So a lot of people don't know this, but there's a very helpful meta property here called DOM ID. This will be unique for this element throughout the DOM document object model. So basically in the page that you see on the browser, this ID will uniquely identify a certain element. So let's call this the last button. Not a very helpful name. Use better notation in your projects. So let's save this, and then, so let me copy this. Let me go back to the Notepad++ here, and then I'm going to use the hash sign and then add my DOM ID, and then open and close parentheses or curly braces, and then let me add my background style. Background color, let's do gold, some weird color. There, let's save. And then, so this button here will be gold. So even though we have the primary color that's applied, we have a class here that's applied. So it has a DOM ID of the last button. So I don't really know what to do in this case. I save. And so let me close scenario 1 and try reopening it. I don't know what to do to force the designer basically to read my custom style, but here it is. You can see this actually looks quite nice. A gradient of colors. This last button has a DOM ID of the last button, and if we look at it in the client, so let me refresh this. If we look at it in the client, so let me select this button, and let's see what color is actually being applied. So you can see here, we're going to add one more layer to this. In a second, I am almost out of recording time. You can see here that there's the default style that's trying to be applied. It's crossed out. So this one is superseded by our custom class, which is again superseded. I think that's the right word, superseded, right? More important, more specific in our case. We're talking about specificity, which is an actual term. Here you can see our ID selector, and the style that's being applied in the end is background dash color. So even though there are three competing properties trying to style, or three competing selectors trying to style the same property, in this case background color, one of them can only be displayed at a time, right? And specificity just refers to the client or the browser performing calculations, seeing which one it should use to style. Okay, let's confirm the statement I made that inline styles are even more specific than ID selectors. So let's add an inline style here of background color. What should we call this? Olive. And we can see right away, even in the designer, we'll see something interesting here. There's 4 selectors in this case. I don't know if the inline style is a selector, but all of them are crossed out. So the default one that's applied, our style class that's applied, is crossed out. Our ID selector, that's custom CSS, is also crossed out. And in the end, inline style wins out. Okay, what if we go back to IA button dash dash primary and add and make a stupid edit to it? Let's add the important rule to the default styles, basically. I'll show you what I mean here. So let me go up. Let's go to light, common, button, CSS. We opened this file here before, and we took a look at this property. What if we add the important rule? What do you think will happen in the end? If we add important, this is not a good idea. I do not advise anybody to use this keyword. I think it's better. It does have a use very narrowly. It's better to understand what's actually going on and why you're seeing the style you're seeing than to use this keyword. I feel that sometimes I'm just too lazy to troubleshoot what's going on and use it, but it's not a good practice, obviously. Let's save this and go back to the designer. So let me close these views. I think that forces a reset, hopefully. So scenario 1, all of them are blue. And if we refresh this, we'll see our button here. The background color is set from IA button or dash dash primary. If we look at our second button, even though we have a class, again, it's more specific than an element selector, but in the end, the default class here wins. Why? Because we have this important tag. So even if we have an ID selector here, we have an ID selector, so we have a class. Did I select this one? So we have inline style, we have a class, but still in the end, the class is beating out even the inline style. That's surprising. And then the last one here, we have, there we go. We have inline style, we have an ID selector, we have a class selector, and still the style that's actually being applied in the end is this first class selector, even though it's the highest up in the file. It's the one that wins out because of this rule here, important. So you can obviously see why it's not a good idea to use this liberally. Again, there are use cases for it. I can't think of one from the top of my head. I haven't had to use one. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful. That was a lot of mumbo jumbo. That was a lot of talking and less project style. But hopefully this was helpful. If you want to see anything else about CSS, troubleshooting custom CSS, adding custom CSS to themes, creating your own themes, let me know. Again, like I said, hopefully this was helpful. I even had a last slide for the important rule. Hopefully this was helpful. If you have questions, let me know in the Discord or in the comments below. Otherwise, thank you for watching. Thank you for sticking with me, even though I haven't posted in over 3 weeks. I've had stuff happen in my family that I needed to take care of, but hopefully I'll be back to a more regular schedule. Also, I am working on creating my own custom module, just learning what is going on. in their GitHub repository. There's a project there learning about the build process, learning about Java, and hopefully I'll have a video on how to build your own custom perspective module. Maybe in a month, I don't know. I don't have that much time. Okay, anyways, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.